Welcome to our May session of OWASP Vancouver meetup online. Our first speaker this evening is Wesley Wineberg. The title of the talk is Exploiting and Preventing Deserialization Vulnerabilities. A bit about Wesley. Wesley has worked in the computer industry for at least 12 years, doing everything from web security to firmware reverse engineering. Wes currently works as a full-time bug bounty hunter, and he previously was a member of the Azure Red Team at Microsoft. Really smart guy, and enjoys the offense side of security the most. So with that said, over to you, Wesley.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you for that intro. That basically solves my intro slide here. I'm Wesley Wineberg. This is actually the first time I'm speaking at an OWASP event or attending an OWASP event. Hopefully sometime in the future, I'll be able to come out in person. But some of you might know me from VanSec. I've been going to VanSec a really long time, since it very first started. I had a couple of years off to go and work down at Microsoft, but I've been back in Vancouver for the last year and a bit. So thanks everyone for having me today. So the topic today is exploiting and preventing deserialization vulnerabilities. So deserialization as a topic is something that I really enjoy, but it's a pretty heavy topic. So coming in and speaking for an hour on it, there's only going to be so much that I think makes sense to cover. It would be like if I said that we're going to give a talk on memory corruption vulnerabilities, and I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about Stack Overflows. It would be a lot to cover. So I don't know the best way to get a pull from everyone if I'm going too fast or too slow, or if anyone has questions. I'm super flexible. I like to keep things pretty flexible. So if anyone wants to jump in with a question or anything like that, let me know.
And Wes, what I'll do is I'll monitor the chat and I'll moderate so I can bring it up if someone does have a question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that'd be awesome. And with that said, though, my starting part, and I think a part that we need to spend a bunch of time on, is just what is data serialization and data deserialization. And so it's a little bit of a slow beginning. So just try and bear with me. And on the flip side, if you're like a data scientist and this like you know super well, we'll get to some, I think, more exciting stuff fairly quickly. So data serialization is one of those topics you learn about if you go to college and do computer science. It's probably one of those topics that I skipped the class on and never really learned a lot. But it's actually something that you use day to day if you do any sort of computer programming, and you probably just don't realize it. So serialization is just a way to record structured data. So if you have a computer application, it's going to be working with a variety of objects within its memory. And so serialization is really just taking an object that a computer program might have and writing it out to a file or writing it to the network, or basically recording it in some way. So a really simple example of this is taking data and recording it into JSON format. So we could have a web server and it's got my account information. And so my object, my name's John, my ID is 53 as my example here. So if we told our web application, write this out to JSON data, it would look something like what's below. Somewhat assuming everyone's familiar with JSON data, it could really be any data type. You could have a CSV, you could have XML. The point is basically that we're taking data that's in memory and writing it out somewhere. So data serialization can be done for all kinds of object types. The kinds most people run into when working with computer programs will be simple object types, but later on I'll go into some of the more complex object types and where that might lead to issues. All right, so deserialization is the exact same thing, but in reverse. We want to take some written data and we want to read it into an object in our application's memory. So the two go together. You can have an application that deserializes data. You can have an application that serializes data. But the key point here, and the point that's worth taking a minute to think about, is that normally there's only going to be deserialization vulnerabilities in a computer program, not serialization vulnerabilities. Normally, if you have an object in memory, it's going to be safe for you to serialize and write out to a file or write out to the network. If it's not safe for that, usually you have a different type of vulnerability in your program. Usually you've got some memory corruption or something else already going on. So normally you can trust what the system writes out and serializes. But normally when it comes to user input, that's what you're providing to the application or the system to deserialize. And user input could always be malicious user input. So that's where the opportunity for vulnerabilities will come up. And so the example that I thought of really quickly is thinking of counterfeit money. If you go to the bank or the mint, I guess, if there's some way to go there, and you tell them you want $100, that's like serializing data. They take the money, they give it to you, and it's trustworthy. Versus you taking some money to the bank to deposit, that's like deserialization. They're transferring it into your bank account, but that's where the opportunity to try and give fake money to the bank would be. So these concepts are somewhat important for understanding how the actual exploitation will work, and deserialization vulnerabilities are kind of similar to a lot of vulnerabilities. You can take advantage of them without really understanding how it all works behind the scenes. But I think it helps a lot to really have a good understanding of how things work from end to end. So that is my brief introduction on the two sides of serialization. So I mentioned JSON's a good example format. There's lots of formats that you can serialize data into. So some well-known or common formats are things like JSON, XML, or SOAP, which is just XML over the internet kind of thing, YAML, you kind of name it. Any format that you can write data into can be used to serialize data and deserialize data. Normally you tell someone, hey, I've got a JSON file. You don't tell someone, hey, I've got some JSON data for you to deserialize, but they're one and the same. Some less well-known formats, though, are things like binary Java objects, binary.NET objects. If you're doing Python programming, you've got pickle objects, which are just Python binary objects. And then there's tons of operating system or application-specific formats. So WCF for Windows comes in a compact binary format, or XML, or a number of formats. So you can actually have formats layered within each other. The important part that I always think about, because I always approach things from the attacker perspective, is the harder to read and understand a format, the more likely you're going to find issues. So if you've got an application that uses JSON data, there won't as likely be a vulnerability in the JSON formatted data as there would be if it's also reading binary Java objects. Anytime something's in binary, people have no idea what it's really, what the data really is or how anything's working with it. So with all these formats in mind, the harder it is to read and understand a format, the more likely there's going to be vulnerabilities in it, is just a general rule for deserialization or anything else. So all that said, I learn best if I can actually see in a concrete example. Some people just love learning the science behind things. I just like to see the code. So I've got a simple C# application I wrote up. And I'm going to spend some time on this because I think it's the best example of data serialization and how it can be exploited. Because For C at least, some of the deserialization issues are actually very simple to trigger. For Java, which I'll go into later, it can get a lot more complex, and things can just go from there. So I'm going to try and share my window with Visual Studio, and we will see if this works. New share. Okay, did that work?
Yes.
Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up. That's good. Okay, so here is a super simple C# application that I made. And so here is the application code. If you're not a software developer, don't worry. This is a very basic application. And it's really only got two things it does. It will take the object that it has, and you can click the serialize button and it'll print that out. Or it'll take the serialized input and you click deserialize and it'll read it into an object. And so the code for this is actually super simple. I imported the Newtonsoft JSON library, which is what everyone uses for JSON in .NET. I made a simple account object class. So we've got an email, we've got some fields, and then we've got two functions, one that serializes the object and one that deserializes the object. And then a little bit of filler code so that when you press go, it prints things out nicely. So I'm going to run this, and do you guys see the running application, or do I got to share that too? I'm going to share it too.
Go ahead.
Okay, do you guys see that?
Yes.
Awesome. And I have no idea if you guys can see me too or not, but I guess that's beside the point.
We can see you.
Oh no. Okay. So right here, we're printing out our object as it's in memory. I've just kind of printed it out. If we click serialize, I've told it to serialize this object to JSON data. So that's what you see over here. We see the same fields, but just formatted as JSON instead of a list. So if I change something here, change the name from James to Wes, and maybe change active to false, and then I hit deserialize, that'll show up my changes over here. Now the email is Wes, active is false, I can click serialize again, it's not going to change. So this is our super simple serialization example. And so lots of applications will do things like this. Normally when it comes to deserialization vulnerabilities, it's going to be network communications. That's your main way of getting that data to the application. Normally you don't have an application that has a nice little input box that you can put some JSON data into and just click go. Often it'll be a web service and it takes data input in JSON format. And then internally it's loading all that, loading that into an object. Sometimes though, there'll be applications, even web applications, that take a file as an input, and they're expecting the file to be formatted as XML data or as JSON data, or anything like that. So let's see if I switch back here. Close this application. So this super simple set of code here that takes an object, serializes it, and deserializes it is actually vulnerable to a deserialization attack. And it's possible to get code execution through this application. This is the entire set of source code. It looks very simple, but that's kind of one of the big problems and impacts of serialization issues is their normal outcome is if you can exploit it, you can get full code execution through an application. So they can have a really high impact. And that's what I will show next in just a minute here. So before we do that, I'm gonna skip ahead. I forgot to press Control. Let me Sorry, it's not letting me change slides.
Someone launched a deserialization on US. I could hear it. I could hear the modem sounds in my earphone.
Probably hacked myself. Try launching it again. Or something. Slideshow. From current slide.
There you go. Okay.
Only one thing to do. End task.
That's right. That's right. When all else fails.
It's probably my unlicensed Microsoft Office. I totally have a license for it. Just not on this computer right now, I guess. Okay, I think it's working again. I'm going to share it. Maybe.
Sometimes Sorry. Windows uses you. I like that.
Okay. We're back in action here. Looks like it. Okay, so continuing on. This is our simple example. Hopefully that makes sense. We've got an object. We can write it to JSON. We can read it from JSON. Hopefully a bunch of you are just shaking your heads like, come on, I didn't come to a OWASP presentation to learn what JSON data is. So let's move on to the hacks. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we can exploit this deserialization process to do things that are unexpected or unintended or malicious. So when I was thinking about deserialization attacks, there's a few kind of classic attacks that people think of when you say deserialization attack, but there's actually multiple different ways and multiple different things you can do against a deserialization process. So one that sometimes is overlooked is just providing unexpected data and data that shouldn't be trusted to a system that's deserializing data. And so I've heard of this described as a mass assignment vulnerability. And the idea is, say we have our, go back a few slides here, say we've got our account object here, and we see that it lists out roles, user, or admin. Sometimes, especially with web services, they'll be reading in your current account object, say you want to change your email address, and so they'll have a field, they'll have a function that says update account. And normally they only expect you to pass email and active as the fields, but they'll actually populate all of the fields that you provide for that object. So for that class of attack, people wouldn't normally think of that as a deserialization attack, but it's really one and the same. You're giving extra fields that normally a user wouldn't be expected to be updating. And so I could provide it a roles field and tell it actually update this one to say that I'm an admin, and that will take effect. So that type of vulnerability is fairly common anytime you're just taking all the fields from an object and doing a blind assignment. And an easy one to overlook, because if you code your application so that it normally only passes in the email address and then you inspect the web traffic, you never see a roles field being passed back and forth, but behind the scenes your application will do it. So that is one type of issue. The other thing that can happen with that too is that sometimes there'll be fields that are expected to be a specific value. So say a file path for your profile image. And sometimes you can pass in a whole new unexpected value to that, but only when you're updating the whole object. So untrusted data is the kind of the simplest deserialization attack. Normally when code is deserializing data and it's something more complex than just JSON data, say it's a Java object, which we'll get to in a minute, often code will include custom deserialization functions. So they often will, when you're writing an application, you'll know that you're taking an object, converting it to binary format, sending it to a system far away. And then you know that that system far away that's going to deserialize it, it will need to set up some certain functionality before it loads that into memory. So back to my file path example, maybe it needs to create a directory on the server for your image to be stored on, and then it can load that object in memory because the directory that it needs to use will be there. So as part of the serialization and deserialization process, a lot of languages and libraries allow you to create a custom deserialization handler, and that the code that runs in that handler can be insecure. This is really no different than any insecure code that your application might have, just that it's triggered by the deserialization process. So it will only run when an object is being deserialized. The rest of the time, your object is just treated like your object. And then, so the most classic kinds of attacks that people think of for deserialization attacks, or people talk a lot about, are object type specifications and function trampolines and gadgets. And the two of them kind of go together. When I was looking into this topic a bit for this presentation, I was trying to match some of the terminology that's most commonly used. A lot of this, each language has their own kind of specific way that they talk about handling serialized data. So each of these will have different terminology that you'll see used. For object type specifications, what I'm really getting at with that is instead of just passing back and forth simple objects like we showed in the earlier example where it's just maybe a name and ID, you could pass a complex object, more like our account object in general. But as part of the deserialization process, instead of just passing an account object, potentially you could pass any other kind of object that the system knows about. And so doing this can actually lead to vulnerabilities, and I'm going to demonstrate that next. But before I move on, the last type is what I'm calling function trampolines or gadgets. And this is kind of a follow-on to the object type specification. If you can pass in one object type, nothing stops you from nesting object types. And that's going to be a little bit more complex to go through, so I'm going to come back to this. But the two of them kind of go together. So if you're looking at deserialization attacks, you'll often hear about which gadget you can use as part of the exploit. And really what that is that's just a set of functions that are being chained together, a set of objects that are being trained together. All right, so maybe none of that makes too much sense yet. So let's move on to an exploit example. So this right here is JSON formatted data. Looks like a bunch of garbage on a quick look, but this is actually all we need to exploit my sample application. It is right here. Okay. Good. So here's our object. Normally we deserialize an account object, but if I tell it to deserialize this other stuff, boom, we get a calculator, and Visual Studio gets really mad because it's not the expected object type. But key point is calculator runs, which hopefully everyone can see. And that's all just from this super simple application code, nothing out of the ordinary that you're doing, but it's vulnerable to being exploited. So this object, the difference is we're passing in object type of Windows data object presentation framework. It's got some parameters. The key point is we're making an object a system diagnostic process, which is C#'s way of saying, I want to run a new application. And then the parameters we're passing to it is cmd/c calc, which runs a command prompt, which runs a calculator application. And so the reason this works is because of this line of code that says type name handling equals type name handling objects. So if I switch back to my application, we've got two options set, or we've got, when we serialize the object, the parameter we passed in is that we want to see format identity. We want to have indented formatting for the JSON output. And then as a global parameter, we have type handling of objects as the JSON parser option. And so what this does is it tells it, instead of assuming that it's going to be an account object, which is what we normally are dealing with here, let the object itself specify its type, at which point we will deserialize that type and create an instance of whatever type of object you claim it is. And so in this example, we're claiming that it's not an account object type. We're claiming it's presentation framework type, which has a specific instance as part of it, which is run a process with the parameter. So yeah, as I said, that option allows it to check object types. And so basically, the WISO serial example that I just copied is a very simple one because it just says run this process. You can get to some more complex types, but .NET is kind of nice in this way. If you have a type handling issue, it's actually very easy to trigger the vulnerability. And it's also fairly easy to spot that type of vulnerability. So if you know that you're looking for the type handling property of the Newtonsoft JSON library, you can look through code, assuming you have source code, and see everywhere that that value is set. If it's set to type handling objects or something else, you know that you have a potential deserialization attack. And then the only question is, can your attacker supplied data get to where the application's deserializing it? So I'd like to stop for questions. Has there been any burning questions that anyone has at this point that I can go over? If not, I'm going to come back to some of this, but I'm going to try and switch over to Java for a little bit more complex of examples.
I don't see any open questions right now on the Zoom chat, and let me check on Slack. I don't see questions there. Does anyone have any questions? You can put your hand up as well. There's a little option in the in Zoom, or you can just unmute yourself and state your question. Going once, going twice. Mark Cohen has raised his hand. Mark, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Hey, Wes. So, I mean, there's got to be some way to set some sort of boundaries around that, like whitelisting specific objects or classes?
Yeah, and I'm going to get to that last. So I'm going to go through, well, I just went through .NET, a simple type handling issue. And then I'm going to go through Java, which gets even more complex for how you might try and mitigate it. But yeah, in this case, you've kind of got two options. One is tell it don't do type handling. Whatever object you get, you have to match it in your code to that type. And sometimes your application code, like if this was all our application did, we could just tell it don't do type handling because we only want account objects. The way these vulnerabilities come up is that the developers hear about object-oriented programming and extensibility. And so often they think, great, I don't have to build a per function call handler. I can just have a generic handler and let the system tell me what type of object it is and deserialize that. So that's where you get more into whitelisting, where you've maybe got a list of the object types that your own application supports, and you blacklist everyone else, or what you whitelist yourself only, and then in effect blacklist everything else. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but yeah, you're entirely on the right track. What do you do to prevent this? You don't let user input say what type you want to instantiate.
Thanks very much, Wes. Mark, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was awesome.
Awesome. Any other questions for Wes? All right, cool. Go ahead, continue, please.
All right. So for the next few, I don't have as exciting examples. I thought my .NET application was super exciting because I wrote it in less than an hour and it actually worked. Java is actually the more commonly affected language when it comes to deserialization attacks. I think if you look up exploit code that's been published, probably 3/4 or more affect Java. Some affect Python a little bit, some affect .NET. .NET, I think, will continue to have more and more issues made public for it, but most of them are Java. And part of the reason is because .NET will only, as a built-in option, only let you serialize simple types into a binary format. So my example was using the Newtonsoft JSON library to serialize an object to JSON, but .NET actually has a built-in binary serialization routine. The problem is that it would not work for my account object that I had there. It will only work for strings and ints and a small set of types. Java, on the other hand, will let you serialize any object as long as you mark off that that object is serializable. So when you create your class definition, you add on implements java.io.serializable, and that's more or less all you need to do to tell Java that you can take this object now and write it out to a binary serialization format. There's a variety of ways you can do that. Often it'll be using an object output stream to write the object out to serialize the object, and an object input stream to read that serialized object back in, to read the binary data back into an object in memory. And so this is a binary format that's used for serialization. That's part of the reason why they can serialize any object type. They just write it out to binary and write all the properties that might exist of that object. And so since it's already in binary, if binary data is included, that's not a problem. And so I copied this screenshot from one of the write-ups on serialization and deserialization issues. But it's a good example of what does an actual serialized object look like. And so we've got the hex codes on the left side, the ASCII output on the right side. But basically it writes out a binary object. It's a fairly simple structure. It starts with a header, which is always ACED. I think 005 specifies the version, and that's always static as well. And then after that, it specifies how many fields are in this binary set of data, how long is each field, what type is it for each field, and then what is the field value itself. So if you kind of look through the bits of readable data there, you can see that we've got a Java lang string, so we've got a string object, and its value is Bob. So this, the reason I have this example of the binary data is not just so you can maybe visualize better what it looks like when you write an object out in binary format, but this is also something to keep a lookout for when you're assessing an application. If you ever see this type of data being written across the network, sent to a web service, that kind of thing, that immediately tells you that you have a serialized Java object. Normally, or not normally, quite commonly for web applications, they'll actually take this data and they'll base64 encode it and then write it out over the network. So I had an application I was testing, and it looked like the application was doing something like that. It was this huge Java application. It had a giant full client front end. It had some sort of back end over the network that it talked to. And they actually had taken these types of objects, serialized them into binary data, base64 encoded it, and then gzipped the base64 data, I guess because they realized base64 made it too big once again. So sometimes it can be a few layers that you have to peel back before you get to the raw objects. And in that case, the side effect was you couldn't just use YSO serial to make a payload because it doesn't base64 gzip payloads. You had to add in that layer yourself. But if you end up with an object that looks like this, it's a Java binary object. So just because you have a Java binary object doesn't immediately mean that it's vulnerable to a deserialization attack. It's a good indication that maybe it will be. But back to our .NET example for a second, we were specifying the object type and then telling it, create an instance of this object. In Java, you can do some of the same, except when you create an instance of the object, it will have a limited set of what it lets you bring along with that object. So you can't necessarily say, I want an instance of the process builder object, give me a new application running. Instead, normally, you're getting an object, and that object can only include the field that its object type comes with, and those fields don't necessarily include running anything. So what does happen, though, is as part of the serialization process, there's a few functions that are often run as an object is loaded by Java. So one of them is read object. Others, which happen not as commonly, but still fairly commonly, are read resolve, finalize, a bunch of method calls, where basically read object, it gets called on the object that you provide. And so when you're providing objects, you can't provide the system an object of a class it doesn't know about. So this code I have here, if the system doesn't know what an evil class is, I can't just give it an evil class and it will know what to do. I have to rely on objects that it already knows of. With .NET, our example was just load the class that runs a process. With Java, it's not quite that simple. But the benefit of Java is that people often rely on a lot of libraries and frameworks to get things done. So it's been mentioned a couple times here, but one of the tools for dealing with Java deserialization is a tool called Serial. And what it does is it has a bunch of gadgets that you can use to try and attack an object serialization or deserialization process. So this giant list I have here is a list of libraries that were vulnerable to a deserialization attack. And it's not that these libraries were vulnerable to a deserialization attack, it's that these libraries could be used to accomplish something malicious. So a lot of these, what that is full code execution. You can run anything you want. I could use one of these to run calc. Some of these, though, don't give you quite that access. So as an example, in this list, there's one called file upload one, and that lets you upload a file as its end output. It doesn't let you get code execution. Others, though, Common Collections 1, super classic example, that one does. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is normally what you get to when you start really digging into deserialization attacks, which is gadgets or function trampolines. So I'm going to try and keep this example simple. If it's not making sense, let me know. But the idea is, say we have a server and it will accept an object for deserialization. Any object we give it, it will try to deserialize it. So what you can do is you can give it an object type that it's expecting. So maybe it's expecting an object that has a hash map. And as part of its routine, when it reads that object in, if we look at the first window here, or the first little pane, it'll do some things to that object, and then it will run the function hash code on one of the fields that you've passed as that object. So instead of for that field you pass a string, you could pass another object. So you could have a nested object. Your first object could be account, and as one of the properties in account, it could have file. And file as one of its properties could have image. So for this attack, what you can do is look for what's another function that I might make use of? So you could tell it in this case, I want something you're going to call hash code on. So that drops down to then a class that has the hash code function defined specific for it. So in this case, abstract table model has its own custom implementation of hash code, and that takes basically the input and runs the evoke function. So then there's another class, fn compose. It has an invoke function, and it runs invoke with arguments. That then leads to another class called fn constant, which also has an invoke function that just does a return, but then leads down to fn eval, which has a function that returns runtime exec of the argument. So really what the goal of gadgets is to pass in nested objects, each of which will invoke some existing class's functionality. So all of these 5 windows here, or 5 little snippets of code here, they're all different classes and different objects that exist in a library. So this could be in the Apache Commons collection. Each of these classes exist independently. Normally, each of these object classes wouldn't be related to each other, but they do, however, have all of the same function names, invoke, hash code, that kind of thing. And so the idea is really, as an object gets deserialized, the deserializer is trying to instantiate each one of these objects one by one. So it starts off by trying to instantiate the base object. It sees that it needs to call hash code. So it calls hash code on the object that's passed in. That object that's passed in calls invoke, and so on and so on. So needless to say, in this example, there's only 5 steps that you hop through. A lot of the example gadgets on this list here are at least that. There are 5, maybe more nested objects where they've found the right chain of functions that exist, so that you pass in 5 nested objects. As it layers them each off, all of the functions are there, and then ultimately you end up with that runtime exec method. Runtime exec lets you run any program in Java, so that would be a great goal. So I thought about showing some real-world examples of this and tracing through it. And I thought on a Zoom call, I was already chancing enough just trying to run a C# application. So my main point with all of this, though, is that there's tools that exist for automated finding of gadgets. But even that is not something you're going to want to do unless you can't use one of the existing gadgets. So this list here, I think, is the up-to-date list for Java of gadgets that exist in common libraries. I've tested a lot of Java applications in the last few years. I'd say at least 50% of them make use of Apache Commons. And so then it's really just a question of, are they using the newest version of Apache Commons collection? Or are they using one of these older vulnerable ones? If not, sometimes some of these other libraries are used. Some of the Spring libraries, they're a bit older, but sometimes are in use. Even just the JDK 7 version 21 library can sometimes affect it. So if any of these are applicable, they're the easiest way to exploit Java gadget deserialization. But if you don't have those libraries available, then sometimes you'll need to try and find it yourself. And if this picture is any indication, if you're trying to read through all the objects that have been loaded into memory and figure out which ones call a function that does something useful, it gets really tedious after about 1 or 2 hops. So it really is worth the time to get one of the automated tools working. It used to be that there was not really any good automated tools for it. Now there's a lot better ones. So the requirement for any of these is that you have the class path libraries that are loaded. And maybe that's a point I should highlight. So we could have the simplest of application. It reads in an object, deserializes it, and prints hello, and then the name from that object. It only needs to have these on the class path. So any of the vulnerable libraries, they don't need to be in your application code. They just need to be accessible on the class path. And then your target application, all it has to do is deserialize an object. If they're on the Java class path, then the deserialization attack can make use of those libraries, classes, and functions. So if these libraries are in place, these are all accessible through a tool called Deserial, and really all that will do is create that payload similar to what we pasted in my .NET app. It'll create a binary data payload that you can then paste to the application for it to run. So I don't want to take too long on time here. I know we got Brodie coming up and his talk is going to be great. So I'm going to move on to prevention. What to do about this. So I already had the question, well, what do I do? Why? How do I deal with deserializing JSON data if that's something I need to do every day? So my first recommendation, I think the best recommendation is just don't do it. It's kind of like in high school, like what's the best way to prevent this? And they're like, just don't do it. So the main point is that don't deserialize untrusted data. Lots of applications have application-to-application communications, and your application and another trusted application are talking to each other. And so in cases like that, deserialization might not actually be a prompt. There's no way that an attacker can influence that data. It doesn't necessarily matter that you're deserializing data and not checking any of the things that might trigger a deserialization attack. But if you're taking in user input and deserializing it, that's when you can run into an issue. So then the next best recommendation is to only deserialize simple objects. So JSON's a good example of simple objects. You know, you can pass it a string, you can pass it an int, you can pass it a Boolean. They're all simple object types. They're easy to type out in JSON. But as long as you're only deserializing simple object types, it's easy to say, don't allow custom object types to be specified. And that in and of itself will prevent most attacks. There has been from time to time vulnerabilities found in the JSON parser and the JSON deserializer. But those are pretty rare, and they get a lot of attention and fixed really fast because everyone needs to be able to parse JSON data or parse XML data. I also thought about trying to list out some good examples per library of what to do, but I started to end up with a pretty massive list. So really, each type of data parsing library that you might use generally has its own library specific option. And this reminds me a lot of external entities attack, XXE, where you need to know per library what option to set to tell it don't read a malicious XML header. It's a similar case for data deserialization. So the Newtonsoft by default is actually secure. It's only because the type name handling was set to object that it would deserialize an object. And I think if I'm sharing my whole screen, I can show that really quickly. If I take this line out of the default serializer setting, this, as I mentioned, stops me from deserializing random object types. It forces me to use an account object type. But if that's all I need to do, then I'm okay. I feel like this didn't change. Let's see. No, it didn't change. Oh, my examples were going too good to just work. Give it one more try.
Worth
right, Wesley. No live demos over here, man.
It didn't work. I don't know. It's not rebuilding it. Previously, when I commented out this line, I'll tell you what it should do, is this type field actually goes away altogether. And it just, even when you serialize the data, it no longer provides you a type object. This was working when I previously tried it. Of course, during live, it's not going to, but when that type field's gone, then it stopped me from pasting in a new type object. When I do that, it just throws an error. It says, I'm not expecting this type field. I don't know what to do with it, and so on. So that type of thing is going to be library specific. That only affects Newtonsoft's JSON library. There is actually other JSON parsing libraries that people use with .NET. Some of them don't let you specify arbitrary object types, some do, and then each of those will have a way. For this specific Newtonsoft library, if you do need to allow multiple types of objects, there's different ways that you can check the type before instantiating it. So that's another solution. For Java though, and especially Java binary serialized objects, it gets a lot more tricky. Java is all about extensibility, so you can build in, you can tell it how to extend your deserialization routine and how you want that deserialization process to happen. So there's a concept called class whitelisting or blacklisting, where you basically re-implement or extend the deserialization routine, and then you tell it only allow or disallow these types of object classes to be loaded. And so sometimes that's your only option if you need to deserialize JSON binary data. You kind of have to go through the JSON or the Java parser and the Java deserializer, but you can extend it and you can block certain classes. So in that case, you can do things like block every class except for your maybe 20 object classes that you're expecting. It gets to be tricky though if you're using any sort of generic object classes, because sometimes you can still find a gadget where that object class allows for this function to be called, and then you're back in the same starting position. Really, a lot of these prevention techniques only come from the need to try and deserialize untrusted data in the first place, but goes back to my first point. If you're inventing a new protocol or a new web app, you don't have to start by deserializing untrusted data. You can force it to be passed in JSON format or XML format or whatever with only simple object types and never really run into these challenges. So often things like class whitelisting or even class blacklisting are what you have to do when you've got an already deployed application that people are exploiting and you're trying to fix. And so blacklisting, I say do at your own risk. Part of the reason for that is because of this list here of known gadgets that are ready to go. If you look at Commons collection, it's got 1 through 6 as gadget paths that have been found for various versions. And some of these versions overlap. So you've got Common Collections 1 that affects version 3.1, and you've got Common Collections 3, which affects version 3.1, and Common Collections 5, which affect version 3.1. It's because there's multiple ways to get to the same functionality, which is run arbitrary code. And so sometimes if you try and blacklist what you think looks like an obvious bad class, there's still other ways to get to it. So with the time we have, there's so much more that could be covered, but there's not time for. These links are all super good. I'll send this presentation out so people can just click the links instead of trying to write them down. But the key points from this list is tools for getting the payloads that you need to give to a server to actually exploit it. The main one's Why So Serial. The original version was made for Java. In the last few years, a .NET version was made as well. There's kind of the classic article and write-up on deserialization issues from Foxglove Security. They weren't the first by any means, but they just realized that people were constantly overlooking this problem. So they dropped a ton of vulnerabilities in big applications, WebSphere, JBoss, that sort of thing. That affected thousands of servers. But the write-up's actually really good and pretty easy to follow. It talks a lot about finding the vulnerabilities, not as much about what causes them. And then on a similar vein, there's a cheat sheet that I've got linked there, it's kept relatively up to date of the new presentations and techniques that are found. So if you're testing a system and the existing vulns don't work and you want to know, well, what's new, what might I want to try, I found that to be a good resource. And then I listed just a few presentations I really liked on this. And their whole presentations trying to cover just a couple of my slides, like gadgets. Gadgets you could make into a 3-hour session and still not cover it all. Is kind of how I feel. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if we got time. If not, feel free to email me or hunt me down on Slack or anything like that. I'm always happy to share my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Wesley. We do have time for a couple of questions. If people want to either raise your hand or type it into the chat, we can then unmute and ask. I'm looking at the chat. No one has posted anything recently. There were a few side conversations going on, which is fantastic. Thanks, Dana, for the plug-in recommendations and everybody else for answering each other's questions on there. I don't see anything on the Slack channel either. And I don't see any raised hands, which indicates that there are no questions. So, oh, there we go. Thoughts on wrapping serialized data with a signature scheme to avoid tampering. What do you think, Wesley?
Yeah, and so I've seen some of that in the real world, and it's kind of two varieties. One variety is the thought that, okay, well, we need to get data from system B to system A, but it might go across a channel we don't trust. But system B and A, we both trust both of those completely. So that's a great solution. And basically, you're moving from having untrusted data to trusted data because it's signed with the signature. You trust the party that has the signature. You trust yourself when you're deserializing it. So that actually is a very effective solution. That's more or less the same though as just wrapping it in a SSL connection or something like that, where you know that the transport hasn't been tampered with. But more often I'll see that kind of thing where it's like a band-aid that's being applied in the hopes that a problem's being solved, where your end user application will sign the payload before it sends it out, but the end user application runs on an untrusted user's computer. So then my job as an attacker is basically I take that end user application and I figure out, well, is it a hard-coded key that's used to make that signature? Is it a per session key used to make that signature? But basically I'll figure out where in memory or where in the application code your signing key is, and then I'll just be able to sign my own malicious payload and send it out. So definitely will stop someone just taking the WISO serial payload generator, sending that to your application and exploiting it. But as I mentioned briefly, so would gzipping the data or any type of slight alteration. The problem is really, can you trust that data in the first place or can you not?
And I guess thanks, Wesley. I guess that's one of the, like when you're looking at a JWT token, JWT, they're signed by default, right? Like that's one mechanism to protect that data. As that token's being passed around, it's a signed token. No one can modify those claims. That's one example of achieving that. Yeah,
that's a great example. So if you are ever able to sign your own JWT token, JWT token, you've got a problem, right? Because you just say, no, I'm actually user Bob, and the system has no idea. Normally, the signing's left to someone trusted.
Awesome.
So if you're able to achieve that, then you're good to go for deserialization. But often it's untrusted users.
Yeah, if it's not signed. Yeah, I've seen also organizations just using HMAC. So they'll just take the message and then generate an HMAC, and then, you know, if you could verify it, then it proves that the other party was a trusted party that had the key that could generate it. That doesn't work in cases of like where the client is on the browser side, because but by the default, the browser side is considered untrusted. So those solutions are only work on between servers or where you're round tripping something from the server back to its other servers. Cool. Any other questions before we wrap it up? I don't see anything on the Zoom. Great. Well, thanks again, Wesley. That was excellent, very educational. Really appreciated it. And yeah, we'll make this video available later on, and Wes will contact you if you don't mind sharing the PDF of the deck or something, we can put it up on. We'll give it to Amir and we'll put it online as well.
Yeah, I'll send that over.
We are going to go into the final section of this evening, which is going to be a talk by Brodie. Brodie, are you on there? I see you are. Are you?
Yeah, I'm around.
There we go. I heard you. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, great. So, yeah, Brodie's our second speaker. We're very excited to have him today. And Brodie is going to do a talk titled Cryptography 101. So a little bit about Brodie. Brodie is a Vancouver-based privacy and security specialist with over a decade of security experience in enterprise, SaaS, and telecommunications. He's particularly interested in cryptography, radio, and secure communications. It's pretty awesome. When he isn't hacking or trying to answer the question of why tinfoil is only shiny on the outside, you'll likely find him brewing, drinking, or talking about beer and Brodie. I have no idea what that is, Brodie. Maybe you could tell us. But with that said, I'll pass it over to you.
Zemergy, the study of fermentation science. I'm a fan of all things fermented.
I learn something new every day. Thanks, Brodie.
Yeah. No problem. So I'm joining the OWASP group this evening using my iPad, and so we'll see how this goes. Try to share the presentation that way, but just give me a sec to see how this works.
And by the way, this is still continuing to record, so the entire session will be up on our YouTube channel. We'll post this in the previous sessions once we clean things up. And you can view them, and then the decks will also be made available so just Google OWASP Vancouver chapter. We have a page officially on the OWASP organization website.
Perfect.
Or now GitHub.
Let me just see here.
And big thank yous go to Amiran for maintaining all that stuff. Amiran, thank you so much for keeping our OWASP chapter page maintained and adding all the stuff. Thanks to Eric also for doing all of our social media, sending the communication to the mailing list as well as other communication channels. If you're not on our mailing list, go to the OWASP Vancouver page and join. And you can also join the Slack channel there as well. And we see your screen now, Brodie.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm really excited to give this presentation. I've presented before at B-Sides on the subject, and I really like this. I really like this talk because it covers a lot of ground from the very basics up to some more advanced stuff. But I find that a lot of people really benefit from a good refresher. So I'm really excited to get into it. But first, I'll just introduce myself here. So I'm from Vancouver, born and raised. I've been hacking software since I was probably, I think, like 8 or something, mainly to play video games for free. And then sort of towards the end of high school, I went into sort of full stack web application development with, at the time, LAMP stack stuff. And basically, I like to joke that it was either this, with all the stuff that I got into, it was either this or jail. I'm currently the head of security at Dapper Labs, which is a startup in Vancouver that's doing some blockchain stuff. I'm actually working for the parent company, but what we do is my company built a blockchain. It's called Flow, and we literally rolled our own crypto for that. And if there's one thing I want everybody to take away from this particular talk, it's don't roll your own crypto. You don't want to do it. Trust me, and I know that more now than ever. So let's dig into it. First of all, what is cryptography? So cryptography fundamentally is about secret messages using math and algorithms. So today, obviously, cryptography is used to control who can see everything. It's all over the place. It's also used to guarantee authenticity of messaging as well. We did a lot of talking about that in the last presentation, where things like signatures over top of serialized data, JOT came up, and so JWTs, I'll talk about that in a little bit. But just to give you an idea of where we're at in 2020, the vast majority of web page loads over modern browsers are using HTTPS. I pulled some stats a few minutes ago from one of our endpoints in one of our production services just for the last 24 hours. And even within that encrypted traffic, the vast majority of it now is like moving to really advanced TLS v13. So things are moving along really quickly. So cryptography, fundamentally, the name comes from secret writing. And it's obviously rooted in Greek, obviously not from the Greek god of block ciphers, but in order to explain how cryptography works, I really need to lay out some foundational terms, and I'll get into some more advanced explanations later, but I think that it's really important to hash out some of the basics before we go deep. So I'm going to talk about some basic concepts that we were just talking about in the last conversation about serialization, and we used expressions like base 64. I'm going to dig into some of that, and then we'll talk about how it all sort of ties together. So the first concept is, the first term I want to lay out is data. And we're really, in this case, we're just talking about ones and zeros. No additional context layered over that. It's just the ones and zeros, the building blocks of binary data. The next term that I want to talk about is clear text. So when we talk about clear text, we're talking about normal, meaningful data that you and I can actually understand on its own, that is derived from this data. So it might not necessarily be human readable. It could be binary code, or it could be in an encoded state, but clear text is meaningful information that can be interpreted in some way. Encoding data, the next term, is converting data from one representation of the data into another representation using some kind of algorithm. So, rules and steps. And the key thing about encoding is that using that algorithm, it's very easily directly reversible. So an example of an encoding would be using something like ASCII. So you take binary data, break it out into 8 chunks of 8 bits, and then you can convert that into an ASCII representation. You can additionally take a ASCII representation and you can transfer it back into binary. You can transfer it into base 64, and that's a base 64 representation of some ASCII right there. So the reason that we use encoding is because humans are bad at reading binary, and computers can be bad at parsing arbitrary forms of data. For example, in an attempt to deserialize some information or what have you, you can run into some various issues depending on encodings. So different computers have different architectures, and having a common encoding standard really helps. So a really good example of that is email communication. So if you want to send, for example, a picture, complex image data, it's binary, and you want to send that between mail servers, well, you might not know, but email servers to this day actually speak plain text to each other. They talk using regular ASCII character set characters like the ones on this screen. And so you can actually open up a terminal, connect to a mail server, and speak to it in these terms to communicate. And if you want to encode binary data into that, we use base 64. And so that's what it looks like in this particular case. A basic base 64 single pixel image encoded looks like that. Another example, we were just talking in the last presentation about JWT tokens that are broken up into 3 sections. One defines the algorithm. The second is a core message. In this case, you can see base 64 decoded, that we're looking at a JSON object that's flat. It's not expanded, but that's a JSON object. And then on the third part, and they're separated by periods, is the signature for that particular JSON object. So you can take any JSON, and then between, on either side of the dots, you can pass those through a base 64 decode. Obviously, there are things like Burp Suite extensions that will do all of this processing for you, and websites and things, but fundamentally, it's just base 64 decoding and encoding. So the next term is ciphertext. And what we're talking about with ciphertext is it has the property that it can't be understood without an additional piece of information. We typically refer to that as a secret. And the other property that we typically have with at least good ciphertext is that if it's done well, it appears to be random. And usually ciphertext is on its own not, wouldn't look like text unless it was in some way encoded. So the better, a clearer definition of encryption here is to use a secret to convert clear text into ciphertext that without the secret is meaningless. So this is kind of what you would end up looking like if you took you took some clear text and encrypted it, and then passed it through a decryption function using a secret, you would just get it this way. It's just a simple metacode representation of what that process looks like. And so an example of a secret in this case, it doesn't necessarily have to be a piece of data like a key. A secret could conceptually be something like an algorithm. So a famous algorithm is to shift 13 places in the alphabet for each word character of a string. This has some limitations depending on the type of information that you are trying to encrypt. So again, going back to the idea of the data here, if you want to encrypt a piece of text, then you get this type of string output, and you can decrypt it again using the same secret typically, but you'll do the reverse option, the reverse algorithm. In what I would call real cryptography and real encryption functions, typically if you repeat the same function, you run the same process against ciphertext, you'll end up getting roughly the plain text out on the other side. Depending on the algorithm, you'll be doing a bitwise XOR, but I'm getting myself get ahead of myself a little bit, so I'll circle back to that. So here's a visual representation of what some random encrypted data looks like. And you can, this is a screenshot actually out of the tool Burp Suite. You might recognize it if you've ever used Burp Suite to do bit correlation analysis. But what this shows you is basically the frequency analysis of different characters across by percentage. And so it shows you sort of the bit offset correlation at different percentages. And basically you want to see random noise across this curve, basically a flat distribution. And this is an example of crypto that is not exactly perfect. And this is, in fact, you can, if you've been doing this long enough, you can look at signatures like this and actually recognize the pattern in the data. So for example, with this particular signature, this is a J session ID that's been encoded in it, or it's sort of pseudo encrypted, but you can tell that it's not true random data because it has these blocks. So it helps to understand encryption by comparing it to encoding. So encoding is taking some source data and then applying a public known algorithm to change its form. And encryption requires the source data and then that secret information. So it can be a digital key that is held private. It can be an algorithm that is only known between the people that are communicating to each other, or it can be a combination of both, and typically is a combination of a well-known algorithm and a secret key that the algorithm uses. And strong cryptography should be able to withstand the source code of the algorithm itself being perfectly understood, because it takes advantage of certain mathematical properties that I'm going to dive into to ensure its safety. So this is what encoding and encryption looks like when it's combined. With PGP as a classic example of this, if you combine the two together, you will, when you apply encryption to a set of data, get essentially scrambled binary data out the other side, which you would then pass through base 64 encoding, and then it gives you this handy representation of the data that you can much more easily pass between systems. And a PGP parser on the other side will be able to read this data, decode it from base 64, and then pass it through a decryption function. And by the way, as I go through the presentation, I might not be able to see questions because I'm presenting on my iPad. However, if there are questions and one of you can maybe speak up and interrupt me with audio, that's totally fine. But just for what it's worth, I'm not actually going to be able to see written feedback because I'm presenting, because of the way that I'm presenting. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that if anybody has any questions or comments, wants me to sort of speed up or slow down, feel free to just speak up a little bit.
Thanks, Brodie. I'll keep an eye on the chat. There's been some interesting conversations going on in Zoom, and I encourage everyone to participate, but no questions yet.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so let me just talk about encryption for a second and how it actually works. So ROT13, not exactly. The Caesar cipher is not exactly the best version of encryption. So let's talk about what it looks like today. And just to refresh ourselves on what this looks like, we're converting a secret using clear text into ciphertext. And in order to dig into exactly how this works today, I want to introduce another term called the XOR, or exclusive OR. This is really the workhorse of encryption today. And what it is this logical operator. Bear with me, it's not that complicated. Basically, if you have two bits, a bit represented by A, the column on the left, and B, a column on the right, you can XOR these two bits together such that you're basically saying A or B, but not both. So if either of the bits has a 1 in them, then you get a 1 on the other side. And if both of them or none of them do, then you get a 0. And so the truth table, as they're called, is displayed on the bottom left quadrant of the slide there. So take a second on that. I don't want to go too quickly through this particular section because it gets a little hairy, but hopefully everybody's got their head wrapped around that simple property of what an XOR is actually doing. And I'm going to extend this a little bit to looking at a bitwise operation. So you can take a set of bits and you can XOR them against another set of bits. And if you do that at the byte level, you're still doing a bitwise operation. So it's bit by bit from top to bottom, and you can see the conversion. And this has the very interesting property that if you XOR the first row of bits against the second one twice, then what you actually get on the other side is the original thing. So you can see that the original value arises from it. So when you're doing a crypto operation against this, a bitwise XOR, you'll actually get back to the original message. This is a pretty important property of XOR and why it's used for this encryption. So an example of where this is actually used in encryption is a concept called a one-time pad, and what they're often referred to as perfect encryption, because a one-time pad is considered encryption if the pad is randomly generated, as in you cannot predict what it's going to actually be, and it's used only one time against a message. And technically, if the one-time pad itself is longer, the key itself, represented by capital K in this little algorithm, in this little crypto expression here, it's larger than the message itself. And you can mathematically prove that. Shannon's theorems 2.5 goes into it. But the idea here is that if you take the full ciphertext string and then XOR it against a one-time key, you get some ciphertext. And if two parties have the same key, they can, the one person can take their clear text, XOR it, and then the recipient can take their clear text, can take the ciphertext and XOR it against the same shared one-time password or one-time pad, and then they'll get back to the original message. So unfortunately, we don't work with one-time pads, because if you need to send a gigabyte of data to your buddy, you're not going to have a 1 gigabyte file that you've generated for the transmission of that one. You have to get it to him some way as well. So if you're trying to send your friend some data and she doesn't have the setup, what do you do? So we, in reality, use less than perfect encryption, and that takes a few different forms. One, encrypted code block, as it's called. Cipher block chaining is another, and then counter mode, which I'll explain right now. So how do you encrypt a ton of data with these things? The way that this works with ECB, for example, this is the simplest example, is you just have a key of a set length, and then for each chunk of the plain text that you're processing, and I could have written out like piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, I think. This is, this data gets encrypted using the same key for each chunk of data. And so you basically reuse the key. It's not as good as your one-time pad because you have to reuse the key, but still, if you don't know what the key is, it is, at least theoretically, really hard to tell what the plain text was given some ciphertext. We've learned that there are obviously some pretty big problems with reusing these keys. So here's a visual illustration taken from Louis Van Houten's Crypto 101 book. where you can actually really, like, you can't do any better than this particular image. So if you actually use a ECB mode cipher to take a large set of data and encrypt it block by block, this is actually what you see depending on the block size. In other words, how big the chunks are that you encrypt piece by piece. And what you see here is the property of what's called determinism, which means that given an input block of data, you will always get the same output block of data. And so there might be a subtle shift, but if you're encrypting a red pixel into something, it's always going to come out the other side looking like the same thing for every pixel. So you'll still be able to see an incredible amount of data about the ciphertext message, even though you are doing potentially a very advanced crypto operation. You're doing it in a way that's deterministic through key reuse, and this is the flaw that emerges from that. Even with a significant block size, you can see in the C example, you can very clearly read the original message still. So a better way to do this is through something called cipher block chaining. So you might have heard CBC mode encryption. And the way that CBC mode works, and this is like used today in many cases, but you'll see it in wireless like WEP and WPA, that the encryption algorithm takes the plain text and then encrypts it with a key, and it has the interesting property that the ciphertext of that particular block then gets added in the second chunk with plain text. You XOR the ciphertext block with the next block of plain text, pass it through the crypto function, and then get another chunk of ciphertext. So this introduces the property that two pieces of plain text will have different output as they go through the encryption function. And if you rerun this encryption function repeatedly, and you can see on the left-hand side, there's this concept of an initialization vector. This is something that you would define at the start of the function of the encryption and make a note of, and then it would have the property that even with the same plain text and the same key, every time you run this function, every single block of data would be pretty random and very different from the previous time that you did it by virtue of the way that this is implemented. There are still several attacks that can be done against this for a variety of interesting reasons. Padding attacks and the way that, actually I'll get back to that in a minute. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but I have to explain, unfortunately, some more terminology before we can get back into the details of this. But that's what cipher block chaining looks like. And the way that you would decrypt it is you would take that ciphertext, pass it back to the same function, essentially, and then you would work your way backwards through the chain of data. The one downside of this, of course, is that if you want to decrypt a subset of the data in the middle, you would have to run the whole chain of decryption across a large data set in order to get to the value in the state that would allow you to decrypt a certain block. Hopefully that makes sense to people, but that's the property that this chain has, is that it's encrypted pretty quickly and decrypted out of sync is a little bit harder. And actually, if I explain counter mode here, you can actually see the benefit of doing this process a little bit differently. So with Galloway's counter mode form mode encryption with a block cipher, the difference here is that you don't actually have to have the blocks chained together necessarily. What you do is you essentially use I hesitate to call it an IV for every block, but basically what you're doing is for every block that you're encrypting, you take what's called a nonce and an initial counter value, which doesn't have to be anything special and usually is like 0 or 1. And the two of those are sometimes called an initialization vector, but the idea is that you essentially have this nonce, which is never reused other than this particular crypto operation for this set of data, and then a counter value, which is typically the same thing, but just incrementing with each block of data. And what you'll do is you'll just do this block by block. And for every block of data, you take that plain text and the key again, and you also XOR in that nonce value on the top of it. And this is the benefit of this particular form, is that each block itself is independent. And so if you want to decrypt the data at offset 7, you just take your nonce, you take the counter, you set it to 7, you take your ciphertext and the key value, and bam, you get back to your you can get back to your plain text value. So this is good for out of sequence decryption, but this actually is highly susceptible to bit flipping attacks and other exploits. So while it's very fast and while it's used in most of the more advanced crypto algorithms today, it has its own pitfalls, as all crypto seems to. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but this is susceptible to bit flipping attacks when implemented naively. So in order to explain how you combat bit flipping attacks, I have to jump back to the terms and talk about something called hashing. So hashing is essentially converting a full piece of data using a compression algorithm of sorts to a typically much smaller but unique identifier representation of that information. And the analogy that I like to use, and that's pretty common, is to think of fingerprinting. It's not a perfect analogy, but essentially if the algorithm is taking someone's fingerprint, then the input would be the actual data, like a real person's finger, and then the output would be a unique identifier called a hash, or a digest, in this case, the output of it. The analogy is flawed because a real hash would not actually tell you anything about the originating data. So I want to just make it clear that that's not the case. Although in my defense, I took this screenshot, and if you actually look at tools like SSH, for example, they call them fingerprints. So I'm going to keep using the bad term because it's convenient. So here is an example of what you can do with SHA-1 for hashing. So some example SHA outputs. And the main point of this illustration here is to show you that by making very subtle, simple changes to a string, you completely change the hash output representation of the data. So minor changes to the input data cause massive cascading changes to the output of the hashing function. And that makes it implausible to determine from the output what the input is, sort of, unless you pre-compute all of the inputs, which, going back to the previous the Jeopardy where we talked about salting, that's where salting comes in right here. Because you can pre-compute tons of these hashes very quickly. That's one of the features of SHA-1, for example, is it's lightning fast. But once you've pre-computed it against a bunch of common strings, then you can take a SHA-1 and then look it up in what's called a rainbow table, and then work your way back to the original value. This is where rainbow tables come in. So the uniqueness property of a hashing algorithm is referred to as collision resistance, and it should be extremely hard to find more than one input that results in the same output. And so when we hear about SHA-1 being broken, what we're talking about is the fact that a bunch of spare computing power used by a Google research team was, in the not too distant past, used to generate, to be able to generate a collision in SHA-1 signatures from different input data. But it's still pretty infeasible, and SHA-1 is still fairly useful, at least when it's not used in this direct naive hashing format. It's still frequently used in tools like Git, and it's used in HMAX, and is not susceptible to the same types of collision attacks that you would that have been exploited by teams like Google's research team. So if you're using an output, if you have an output size of a SHA hash that's really long, but then you have this small amount of input data, the way that the hashing function accounts for this is using something called block padding. And that just means taking the hashing function processes the data in a set of blocks of a fixed size, and if the input into a particular block is smaller than the length of that block, then what the function will do is typically some form of padding, and sometimes that padding takes the form of things like PKCS5 padding as a version of padding, And when you implement something like cipher block chaining, for example, which I talked about a minute ago, that the padding oracle attacks that you hear about with something like cipher block chaining involves toggling the bits one by one in padded values in cipher block chains and trying to learn bit by bit what the original data in the stream was by looking at the checksum verification of that cipher block chaining algorithm. And it's way too much data. I don't have slides to explain the details, but if you're wondering where the vulnerability in cipher block chaining comes from, it's related to this, and it's the exact same concept as padding that's applied in CBC as you see in something like a SHA-1 hashing algorithm, where the data is smaller than the output for that particular for a particular block. So what is this output anyway? Like, there's this input string, and then there's all this gobbledygook on the right-hand side, and so this is actually encoded in hexadecimal. So hex is base 16, and you can see that SHA-1 output, if it's 160 bits, that's equivalent to 20 bytes. And you can see each one of these pairs of characters is representing a byte, and there are 40 hex characters in total. So this is an example of 3 different encodings of the same data. So the use cases of hashing versus encryption, just to clarify, hashing is used to validate information. It enforces the property of message integrity when it's paired with the original value. So an example kind of is like passwords. You don't really need the original value. You can take a hash of a password and compare it to a password that has been stored in your database, and you don't know the original value. You just compare someone's password the hash of a password that they've given you to a password hash that's been stored in the database. Again, you want to salt that information, but at the same time, if you don't need to know the input necessarily. If they just give you a hash of their password, they can compare it. You can compare it. Encryption is used by comparison to keep the data itself secret. So you keep the data safe. It's used to keep data safe in transit, and it's also used to encrypt data that's stored. And it's just so that if you read the data, you can't decrypt it. So I'll explain that a little bit more here. So perfect encrypted data, let's see here. So yeah, when you combine hashing and encryption, what you're trying to do is you want to encrypt the data, but you can still, when it's in encrypted form, an attacker can intercept that encrypted data and tamper with the cipher stream to change the output cipher as the output clear text that a recipient is getting on the other side. And so the way that you would protect against that is to actually use a signing algorithm of some kind. So this is sometimes called AEAD, or there are a few different ways to do it. You can encrypt and then authenticate. You can, where you basically encrypt the data and then apply something like a message authentication code or an HMAC algorithm to the encrypted data. You can authenticate and then encrypt the data, and encrypt then authenticate is used in some contexts, and auth then encrypt is used in others, or arguments for both. TLS, auth then encrypt. And actually, technically, there's a third, authenticate and encrypt data, which is actually used by OpenSSH. So we're talking about SSH being a secure replacement for Telnet. You have to be very careful with the implementation, but OpenSSH actually uses an encrypt and authenticate, where it creates the encrypted text and also HMACs the clear text message in addition to that. So they're done in parallel. And there's the bonus term here is because I mentioned it, HMAC is message authentication codes. So the hashing and encryption are often combined together to encrypt data and also to verify its integrity. So there's 2 different ways that encryption is used, and you'll often hear the expression data in transit for secure communication. And this is typically for establishing a temporary channel for communications. and the keys are usually ephemeral and shared only for the duration of the session. And in fact, those keys are often rotated multiple times during a session. The other version, data at rest, what we're really talking about is secure storage. So to use an analogy, in transit, you're talking about an armored truck moving valuables between banks. And at rest, you're talking about storing those valuables inside of a safe. And you can combine the two. In theory, you can have your encrypted data at rest stored in a safe, put the safe inside of a truck and move it around. Nobody on the outside of that truck can actually access the contents of it, including the driver of the truck potentially. Bit of a weird analogy. So the other piece that's really important in this is, okay, so you've got two people who are talking to each other and they want to use these ephemeral session keys and they don't have one-time pads that have been pre-negotiated. So how on earth do they actually talk to each other? How do they set up keys? How do they actually establish the secrets that they're going to be using to talk to each other? And for that matter, how do they even know who they're talking to, which is another problem entirely. But it turns out that there are very cool ways to establish a shared secret over an open channel with adversaries listening in a way such that the adversary in the middle can't actually understand what secret's being generated by both parties. And I can explain key exchange in abstract using this metaphor. So say you want to send something to somebody in a storage container like this. Alice wants to send a super secret message to Bob using a secure channel via this little container that people can't see inside. So the first thing that Alice wants to do is she's going to take the container, she's going to put her message, the clear text message, inside of some kind of encrypted tunnel, in this case, a storage box. And what she can do is she can put her lock on this particular storage box like that. So now this storage container is locked. And in theory, only Alice can open this particular lock, right? So the next part is Alice will send this sealed message over to Bob. And then Bob can apply his own lock. So now you have two locks on this particular case. So now nobody can open this particular message right now. Nobody, not Alice, not Bob, because the thing has two locks on it. So someone in the middle just has this lockbox. They can't do anything with it. Now, Bob can send this message back to Alice with both of these locks on it. And Alice can take her lock off of the storage container. And you can sort of see where this is going. Eve still can't decrypt it. And now you send it back through Eve over the plain text internet back to Bob. And Bob has a case that only has his lock on it. The entire time, Eve in the middle has never been able to decrypt or open this particular box. Bob has the key and is able to open up the box and see the really nice heartwarming message that Alice has left for him inside. So it's like that's your sort of box metaphor for it. The cryptography for it works in a fairly similar fashion. And the preeminent example of a real key exchange is the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. And in order for me to explain this, I have to tuck into a little bit of modular arithmetic here. So bear with me. 3 slides, I promise, although the slides might have some transitions in them. So the simple example of modular arithmetic here is that if you want to convert from 24-hour time to 12-hour time, you could do a modulus 1200 operation, which is basically just taking the remainder. So the remainder of 1619 mod 1200 is 4:19 p.m. Pretty straightforward. Hopefully everyone's following so far. So logarithms. You might have seen logarithms recently in all the graphs where people are talking about the outbreak recently and infection rates and R values. So logarithms are the inverse of an exponent, and they're used often to represent exponential curves over extended data sets in a way that don't make gigantic charts. That's kind of one way that they're used. So it's the inverse of exponentiation. And what that basically means is that if you raise 10 to the third power and get 1,000, a logarithm would allow you to do the reverse operation. If you take the base 10 log of 1,000, you get back to 3. So a logarithm is the inverse of an exponent. And when you're talking about encryption, or a Diffie-Hellman key exchange rather, what you want to be able to do is compute the result modulo some prime number. So what that means is that if you take the 10 to the power of 3, which is 1,000, and you take 1,000, the remainder of 1,000 modulo 13, you end up with 12. You divide it by 13, you get 12 left over. And if you want to figure out what exponent is used in a particular number that has been divided modulo some number, if you want to actually calculate the logarithm, the exponent, what exponent modulo 13 has a remainder of 12, then you have to do a whole lot more work, and it's actually called the discrete logarithm problem. And the fact that it's exceptionally hard to calculate, it's hard to calculate the secret exponent, but it's very easy to verify whether or not it's correct. You can encrypt data and you can easily verify it. So this property is essentially the basis of encryption. It's called the discrete logarithm problem. So this is what a Diffie-Hellman walkthrough looks like, using the actual function, but with just some smaller numbers so that it's easier to visualize. So if Alice and Bob choose their own secret values, 6 and 15 each, but they agree on using a public prime number to in order to calculate remainders, to do modular arithmetic, and they agree on a common base, each of them starts out by raising their base of 5, that's public information, to the exponent of some secret value, and then modding that against some publicly agreed upon prime value, and it's typically a very, very large prime number, which makes it very hard to calculate. So Alice and Bob calculate their outputs from this, 8 and 9 respectively, and then they can, over a clear channel of communication, they can share these values with each other. So I just shift the data over to the left here for a second. So again, we're talking about a base of 5. We're raising 5 to the exponent of 6 and 5 to the exponent of 15, modding 23. So you get those outputs, they share those numbers with each other. And then what Alice and Bob do is they take the outputs of each other's values, and then they raise those outputs again to the exponent of their secret value one more time, and then do another mod 23 operation. And what you can see is that they both arrive at the same output. And this is consistently the case. And the reason for that is because if you take a secret value and raise it, so you take the base of 5 and raise it to a secret value mod 23, and then exponentiate that again and mod 23 again, you get the same output as doing the reverse exponents. And so it's illustrated on the right there. So secret values 6 and 15 never shared over the wire. Both parties are able to arrive at the same secret values. That's the fundamental nature of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and it allows two parties to establish a shared communication channel, establish over a public communication channel a secret shared tunnel. So the next thing I'm going to talk about here is where elliptic curves fit into this picture. And in order to understand how the elliptic curves work with this, there's this property that a line that passes through an elliptic curve will intersect with the curve in 3 places. And if you draw a line from a point A to any other point B on an elliptic curve, and then you extend that line out to the third intersection point, and then draw straight down in the graph like this, you dot it essentially, is you A dot B, you can land at a point C, and then you can draw a line from A to C, and then and then the third intersection point will be between the two in this particular case. You draw the line up, and then you AC equal gets to D, and you can keep doing that function, say 1,000 times, and arrive at some very difficult to predict point. And the property here is essentially that if you have if you've arrived at the same final point via a set of intermediaries, both parties arrived at the same target point, it's very hard to tell which original points, secret points, both parties used, but it follows the exact same mathematical principle of doing the point arithmetic on the elliptic curve out of sequence will still result in arriving at the same destination point. If you're using like a P256 curve though, the curve is not quite as sexy as a standard pretty visual elliptic curve. But it ends up looking like this, and this type of curve is typically found in something like the Mandelbrot set. But this is your typical P256 curve visualized on a 2D grid, and it has exactly the same principle, that there will be 3 points where a line intersects, and you can draw the same visually lines to do the dot arithmetic on a 2D grid and come to a destination, albeit with a much, much larger expanse of 2D space. You wouldn't be able to visualize it directly on the screen, so there's just one step in this case. So why do we use curves? Well, the biggest reason is because the elliptic curves have a vastly higher equivalent strength, and that means that you can work with much smaller key sizes, and you can get significantly higher performance for those key sizes. So if you want to look at an equivalent key strength, for example, a 2048-bit RSA key is probably actually even less secure than an ECDSA key that's only 256 bits. So going back to the output of my my SSH public keys just from my command line, you can see that I've actually got 2 keys here. They have the same fingerprint length, but yeah, the 256 key is an ED25519 key, which is basically like ECDSA. So elliptic curves today are used in all sorts of different stuff. My favorite curve is 25519. It's named because it's based on the prime number of 2 raised to the 255th power minus 19. And that is, for some reason, not displaying properly on my screen. But the P256 curve is also used in a lot of different places. It was created by, I believe that it was more or less standardized by the NSA, but it's used all over the place. The P256K1 curve is used in blockchains like Ethereum and Bitcoin, and its native implementation in Golang is pretty performant, and so we're using it. So on. It's used. Both curves are used all over the place. Basically, just do whatever Microsoft's doing. You know, that's probably going to land you in a pretty safe place. Just do whatever Microsoft says, and you'll basically be fine. I think one of the last things I want to talk about is this idea of symmetric versus asymmetric encryption. So symmetric encryption is where you're using the same key to encrypt and decrypt. So TLS, for example, when you're doing encryption in transit, you're using a temporal session key, basically this throwaway session key that would get swapped out every time. You would do a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and then you would generate these session keys, which would get renegotiated periodically. But they're throwaway keys, but both sides agree on a shared key, and that's typically going to be a standard key. And for encryption at rest, oftentimes you'll use an AES key of some kind to do encryption of some fixed data at rest using an initialization vector. Asymmetric keys, by comparison, have this property of a private public key pair. So when you think of public keys, you often think of PGP, X509 representations of certificates. You might have heard of that. That's asymmetric keys, where a private key will do a crypto function, and then it has the property that only the public key, a public key will be used. You, in other words, share your key publicly, and then anybody can send you a message using your public key, and only your private key can be used to decrypt the message. And signing, by comparison, is sort of the inverse, where you use your private key to do a crypto function on some data, and then only the public key will be able to quote unquote decrypt the signature. So sort of the inverse key operation.
Brodie, there was a question. Nick
Sure.
is wondering what is Hyperledger URSA, and he's wondering why your company didn't use URSA. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure that I caught the question.
I think the question is, what is Hyperledger URSA? And wondering why Brodie's blockchain company didn't use URSA. Does that make sense? URSA.
Why did we roll our own crypto, in other words? Yeah, so part of the, okay, so this is an interesting tangent. I'll try to answer this as quickly as possible. The reason, essentially, that the team, and I'm not a super expert on this particular decision, but my understanding is that the challenge that my company was trying to solve with Flow was in dealing with the performance of chains like Ethereum, which have the ability to mine relatively have a very, very slow block per second mining rate and a very limited number of operations that they can mine per block, which really slows down the mass market adoption. And what the Flow team was trying to do while it was researching the chain was break out the various operations, the various roles, the various operations that need to be done in a blockchain around forming consensus and having Byzantine fault tolerance in the consensus algorithm, and using things like Merkle trees and BLS signatures. And they were really trying to pioneer a space where they could create a super highly performant blockchain that, by breaking out those functions that needed to be done into different roles of nodes, so where a lot of chains are using techniques like sharding for their core blockchain architecture, the Flow team is using a non-sharding method, which has a whole bunch of benefits. But I believe that is why they went down the path of essentially doing a lot of their own cryptography and leveraging BLS signatures. But as to the specifics of why Hyperledger URSA, that crypto library, wasn't used in our native Go implementation as the basis for our native Go implementation, I am not 100% sure, but I believe that it's along those lines. And we can talk about that more later as well.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Brodie.
Yeah. So one of the common misconceptions about TLS is because it uses private public key pairs, it's misunderstood that those key pairs are actually used for the actual session communication. In an actual fact, it's only used for authenticating that you are talking to who you think you're talking to. So when you make a connection to a website, you're connecting to your web application, your GraphQL API endpoint, your gRPC, whatever it is that you're using, you're just authenticating the source using that RSA key pair, and then you're negotiating a ephemeral session key within that for the actual cipher stream communication, and that's typically going to be AES 256-bit. So that's usually expressed in a cipher suite. So this is a breakdown of a cipher suite that is combining all of the things that I have talked about up to this point. So now you can look at one of these cipher suite declarations and actually reason about it pretty easily. So the breakdown of this, when you see a command, when you see a cipher suite like ECDHERSA, you're talking about elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman, ephemeral, with an RSA key and signature for that authentication of the session, and then AES 128 block size cipher communication is being used for the actual cipher stream, and the mode for that AES encryption is Galois counter mode as opposed to CBC, cipher block chaining, and then for the message authentication of the blocks, you're talking about using, in this case, SHA-256. It can be 384, 512, or even in some cases SHA-1. SHA-1 would be totally fine because it's used in an HMAC. To this day, SHA-1 in HMAC mode is quite strong, but typically we're seeing more and more of this form of cipher suite with SHA-2 and SHA-3. So when you take that particular cipher suite deconstruction and then look at an actual modern browser connection, this is a screenshot from talking to github.com, and you can see that this particular certificate is running TLS 1.3, which means that it's using an RSA, typically using an RSA key exchange for the authentication of the session, and then it's encrypting AES counter mode. The exchange is using X25519, a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, so an elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and then the signatures are being done with SHA-256. So there's a lot of different functions, a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that fit into a TLS communication, a TLS session for WebSockets in a browser. But this is how you can make sense of it now. So hopefully all of this background allows you to look at this and actually tell what on earth is going on. Some other encryption ciphers you'll see are like Cha-Cha, Poly 1035, and that's typically used in like Wikipedia. You'll see the X25519 curve all over the place, but the encryption cipher and keys are always going to be some combination of these. And so yeah, this is, I think, basically covers it. I don't know, I haven't checked the time, so it looks like I've been going at this for quite a while. This is normally a 45-minute presentation, but I tried to expand a little bit more. But if you guys want to do some bonus rating, there are some links here. I'll just capture this for posterity. You guys can take a look at that. I really highly recommend the Crypto 101 book, which goes into some of the math. I really recommend Dan Bonnet's graduate applied cryptography book. He's one of our advisors. He's fantastically smart and also able to explain crypto from the ground up in a really great way. We're really lucky to be working with him. And if you want some guidelines on how to do crypto properly, I really like CipherList. It shows you reference TLS configs for a bunch of different tools. And I think that beyond TLS, it might actually have some implementations for non-transport security as well at this point, because it's been around there for a little while. So yeah, does anybody have any questions? And I will back to Zoom.
Brian W. has a question. Why is message signing discouraged with OpenSSH keys, especially with ED 25519 keys?
Is my video back on again?
Your video is back on, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat that question one more time?
Question was, why is message signing discouraged with OpenSSH keys, especially with ED 25519 keys?
Oh, that's a good question. I honestly am not sure why message signing would be discouraged on ECDSA keys, on ED 25519 for SSH. What is the property of ED 25519 where you wouldn't actually want to have message signing? That's interesting.
That is, yeah, that.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure. I mean, it's probably related to being able to over time deconstruct the key material from the session, but I don't actually know. That's kind of
I just wanted to bring that up. This is Brian. I just wanted to bring that up because I was looking into message signing, and I looked at the key types. ED 25519 looked great, and then there was no signing operation for it, which is kind of odd. At least in the implementation for OpenSSH.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure if the ED2. I mean, ED 25519 keys are typically the stronger and the most recommended keys in use today. The newest version of OpenSSH that has native support for hardware two-factor authentication tokens baked into it right now is based on ED 25519 keys. So my high-level understanding, without any detail of exactly what it is in the OpenSSH, the implementation that preempts that signing side of it is that it's safe to use. I don't know exactly why though. So I mean, when it comes to crypto, yeah, don't take anybody's word for it. But yeah, I believe that ED 25519 with hardware authentication is basically the latest and greatest today.
Okay, I guess that requires more research then. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I'm looking on Zoom and I don't see any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask Brodie as well. Brodie, thanks again. There are a lot of people thanking you on the Zoom chat, so that was a great presentation. Thanks very much for doing that. Yeah, any questions?
For sure.
A couple minutes here. All right, going once, going twice, gone, and there's some claps as well. So yeah, Brodie, thanks again, once again, from all of us. Thank you for everyone for attending tonight's OWASP session. It was good. We had a pretty good attendance rate. Once again, I'd like to thank both Wesley and Brodie for the great talks, and of course, all our volunteer board for helping make this happen. And thanks go to Bug Crowd as well for providing the prizes for the Jeopardy winners. And next one is going to be June 18 on Zoom, and the event listing will be available soon. You can check out our OWASP Vancouver page for links to upcoming events and register, and of course past presentations, and as well as links for how to join our mailing list on our Slack channel. Our Slack channel is on the Mars community team, and that's a great place to hang out when these things aren't happening and interact with other members. There's also the Van City Sec meetups as well that we put on. Great place to exchange ideas and keeping in touch, especially in these times where we can't do that kind of stuff in person. And of course, there's going to be a survey that's going to be sent automatically. We'd appreciate it if you guys could take a couple of minutes just to give us some feedback on, what subject presenters, what else we can do better for you and for the community. And on that note, thank you so much. Have a great evening, and see you all next time.